This is the Infotagion podcast, the vaccine to the disinformation virus. We were told that the NHS's track and trace app would be a vital weapon in our battle against coronavirus, yet it's still not fully operational. Is that because the UK government chose the wrong tech? Or do the technology companies have too much control over the data that's gathered by their systems? Also, will exposure to disinformation about COVID-19 make people more sceptical about taking the vaccine when it's developed? I'm Damian Collins, and I'll be discussing these and other issues with Matt Burgess, the Deputy Digital Editor at Wired, Dr. Michael Veale, Lecturer in Digital Rights and Regulation at University College London, and Lucy Dargahi, a Director at Mercury, a public strategy firm, and the co-producer of the Infotagion podcast. So Lucy, can you tell us what's caught your attention recently in the disinformation world?
Thanks, Damian. So, as listeners will know, in order to get to a situation where we are even within a chance of returning to normal after the coronavirus, scientists say we would need at least 82% of a population to take a coronavirus vaccine, the development of which is happening with haste around the world. A new report out this week that caught my eye was by the Centre for Countering Digital Hate. Their report showed that the rapidly growing anti-vax movement online actually risks jeopardizing that goal. In fact, a YouGov survey they published alongside the report showed that as many as 1 in 3 people in Britain might hesitate to take a vaccine, and even more in the US. Their research showed that millions of more people have been engaging with the content online since the beginning of the pandemic. Researchers took a deep dive into these groups, what happens on these groups, and who are the key players who are making huge profits from these kind of channels. In the response which Facebook issued to media on the day the report was released, they said, quote, "We reduce vaccine misinformation in newsfeed, we don't show it in search results or recommend it to you on Facebook or Instagram, we don't allow it in ads, and we connect people with authoritative information from recognized health experts." CCDH told us that during their research, they were able to go and have these deep dives into these groups precisely because Facebook were recommending them in the algorithm, contradicting what Facebook are saying here. In fact, CCDH also showed that Facebook had ran ads from several anti-vax pages since the announcement in March 2019 that they were going to crack down and not allow anti-vax misinformation adverts. So those that CCDH found recently include a number of adverts from David Wolf, who's an anti-vaccine wellness guru, for a product called colloidal silver, a product that the National Institute of Health in the US has stated isn't safe or effective for treating any disease or condition, but he has been touting it as a false cure for coronavirus on social media. In a separate post about the product on his Facebook page, which has 12.3 million followers, Wolf called the product my number one recommendation under the current crisis. So it's clear that despite what Facebook says, it allows its advertisers to target users who have interest in anti-vaccine pages as well as related subject, and it does allow ads that run on this basis.
Absolutely. And do you think, Lucy, that one of the things that I think is inadequate about Facebook's response is that it's just that people principally see stuff on social media because they search for it rather than it is pushed at them and recommended to them by the platforms themselves?
Well, I think what was interesting about their response issued to media is that it was a direct contradiction to what actually takes place. So I wonder whether their press office is coordinated with what is actually happening on the platform here, because evidence that the charity found completely contradicted it.
Yeah, that's right. And I think the figures you quote are huge. I mean, in terms of the volume of these accounts, the amount of interactions, it would suggest that the idea that they are effective at dealing with this is some way off the mark.
And what's interesting about what CCDH have found as well is the sort of monetization part of it. So Imran Ahmed, the CEO, has been saying to media that this is what's interesting about this, and what they call the report is a sort of industry. So it's its own industry online of people profiteering from anti-vax conspiracy theories, including inviting people to pay for certain communications content or give access to certain groups, or funnel them down different paths which lead to more and more anti-vax content. sort of spurred on by fear and mistrust, and sowing mistrust in the situation, which, according to the charity, is very concerning, considering the need for everybody to trust and participate in a vaccine when it does come, in order to return to normal life.
Yeah, that's great. Actually, I mean, Matt, if I could just ask you about what Lucy's been discussing. You've written a lot about healthcare and the coronavirus and the response of tech companies to disinformation. I mean, how do you think the tech companies are when it comes to dealing with medical conspiracy theories? Do you think they're prepared to go far enough?
This is one of these issues that is always going to be sort of very challenging at the time, and is obviously sort of something that we have to look back on and learn from, and particularly the big tech companies. But I think with every time that these sort of cases emerge, whether it's the pandemic or other types of sort of health information spreading through social networks, it's very much a case of trying to get a balance of dealing with stuff in the immediacy and sort of learning from what's happening and how this can be applied going forward. And there's always going to be cases where there is stuff that's spreading sort of at that time. But how tech companies respond to these is something that we've seen over the years of not being something that is particularly proactive. They're very much on the reactive end a lot of the time. And I think that we do need to keep pushing for more. But there has been a sort of circumstances over the past where it's very much been sort of journalists pointing a lot of these issues out, or journalists and researchers, I should say, pointing a lot of these issues out, and then the tech companies responding. So I think it's a case of we do need to sort of see more action being done proactively, and there needs to be ways that people sort of definitely learn from this.
It does seem to, and it seems that we're getting, I think because of coronavirus, a wider definition of what speech that causes harm is.
Yeah, and this is something that obviously sort of you've done a lot of work on it and know a lot about, but it's one of these things that we do still have to come up with a proper understanding of, and the definitions are always going to be changing. And I think that context does have a big part to play in a lot of these things as well. So we're obviously in a time where sort of the world is facing a sort of unprecedented crisis, but I think that sort of what we learn from this and take away is something that is something a slightly more whole picture than we had before, but there's still a lot to be done, essentially.
That's great. Matt, Michael, Lucy, thanks so much for joining us on the podcast. Right, so that's the end bit for the edit. We'll now start at the beginning. The intro is recorded separately, so I'll just basically start the conversation. I'll come to you, Matt, to talk about sort of track and trace first, and then Michael, I wanted to talk to you a bit about some of the things we were talking about in the Onwards call last week, actually, about the way data targeting actually works. And if you want to talk a bit about the trade bill as well, I mean, if you want to talk about that now, then I could ask you some questions on that, but see how we go. Great. So, Matt, it's great to have you on the Infotagion podcast. I and many others have been reading with great interest the excellent reporting you've been doing on the sorry saga of the NHS track and trace app. I mean, do you think the Department for Health just backed the wrong technology from the word go?
I would say that it's a position that I wouldn't like to be in myself from the Department of Health, in terms of like deciding and implementing sort of technologies within sort of track and trace, particularly with the app. So I think when it was first reported that the NHS or NHSX and Department of Health were looking at a contact tracing app, the API protocols from Apple and Google hadn't been announced at that stage, and the NHS was sort of looking at this very early on, which obviously put them in a position of looking at the sort of available research and technologies around contact tracing and apps that were sort of already out there, which is obviously very limited because we've not really been in a situation like this before. So I think they were sort of ahead of the curve in terms of starting to look at this. But then once we saw the sort of introduction and the announcement of the protocols from Apple and Google, that put us in a situation where I think the NHS sort of had a decision to make, whether it was a case of pursuing the technologies that it already started working on and exploring and trying to determine what it could produce, and also sort of considering what was announced by Apple and Google. And I think that at that stage, they had this really tough decision to make, and it's not one that I would want to be sort of in that position of making, but would say that sort of it does appear, now we're a few months down the line, that the wrong decision was probably made. And it's obviously correct to look at all the different sort of scenarios and technologies and potential solutions to this. But now that we've seen sort of a few months down the line, the UK and England in particular is in a situation where we don't have a contact tracing app, I think we're in a position that actually, because we don't have one, it's quite clear that sort of other countries have rolled these technologies out using Apple and Google system. I think that it's a clear sign that we have got to a position where we can probably say that the mess of this situation resulted in probably the wrong decision being taken at some point along the line.
But there are a number of quite interesting things in it, I think. And the first is, in a way, that what this has demonstrated is that you can't actually roll out an app if you're a government, unless Google and Apple are prepared to work with you on it.
Yeah, that's one of the sort of like dynamics that has sort of appeared over the last, in terms of like public conversations, appeared more recently in terms of the power and the infrastructure that obviously Apple and Google control through the devices that are out there and their control of the APIs. However, I would say that I think with the NHS sort of development and what we've seen here in the UK is there hasn't been, for me, a huge amount of clarity around what the purpose of the app was. In terms of, we're obviously looking at, for individuals, contact tracing, being notified when you've been near somebody who has had coronavirus. But from the sort of like centralized system that was set up, there were suggestions of wanting data to detect hotspots and outbreaks, which a centralized system could provide. But there's also the testing and trace system that's in place, the manual system, which is led by humans, which is also providing that sort of data. So there wasn't, for me, a really clear explanation of what the sort of data wanted from a centralized system would produce and how that could really sort of like aid the public health efforts going forward. And I think that sort of like was a key issue in the overall sort of trust of the sort of suggestions that were made for the UK app, because I think for a system like this where you were wanting a lot of people to download this and use it to be as effective as possible, you need trust within the system, and to really sort of like get that within the public, you have to have this setup of people understanding what the purposes of the app are for them and for the creators of the app as well.
I think that's the key thing, isn't it? That people are more wary of it, because we've had these business models in technology where companies have basically gathered as much data as they possibly can, even with the view that it will be useful to them at some point in the future. But people don't really know what they're going to do with it, and people install apps, but then they're asked to accept updates of those apps, and in doing that, they're often asked to give away yet more data without that really being made clear to them. And do you think this is the sort of concerns around the NHS app are a hangover of these general concerns we have about just how much data we give away and what happens to it?
Yeah, I think that there are huge issues with trust in sort of technology and platforms and people's sort of interaction with the systems that they're using, whether that is Facebook or Google or other sort of government-led systems. And there are rightly concerns about the sort of issues that we're talking about here, with the issues of trust, with the issues of privacy, with the issues of data collection. I think, interestingly, online there has been, within certain circles, lots of suggestion of sort of what data could be used from this app in terms of like people harvesting or selling data, which the NHS has been very clear from its perspective that it was never, that's not as intended use case of this. But I think that when you've got that sort of existing, those suggestions, the best way to sort of counteract some of these measures, at least from a public health standpoint, is being as transparent and open with your use cases, your data, what's going to be done with this. And if you look at the sort of like wider test and trace system altogether, I think that has been one of the sort of like difficulties around the implementation of the app, because when we saw the NHS app first being talked about, it was positioned as an app that was going to be a key part of the test and trace system. And then over time, as the sort of like the system has developed, there's been much more emphasis politically put on the human contact testing system. And that system itself has the amount of testing that the UK has been able to do has been, compared to other countries, has been a lot lower. And we've seen that is probably one of the also reasons why the app has sort of struggled to come to fruition, because the UK hasn't had an underlying testing system that is robust, quick, effective compared to others. And as the app has developed, one of the sort of like outliers positions that the UK has been in has been self-reporting symptoms, whereas within other countries, apps and related technologies have been based on test results and verified data, whereas the UK, an initial decision for self-reporting, I think that's very much tied into our lack of testing capability to begin with, and that sort of had knock-on effects with the app altogether. And now we've ended up in a place where several months down the line we don't have an app. The testing and tracing system is sort of getting there, but still there are lots of issues with that altogether, and these problems just seem to sort of knock on and feed into each other. So while the NHS app has had lots of issues around it, and we don't know if we're ever going to get one, I think that sort of the underlying issues of the overall response have contributed to some of the decisions that were made in that process.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think I remember asking early on in the process, I never received an adequate response to this, which is why they needed to collect location data when they could just take the data from the confirmed test results for coronavirus. And then, of course, they then decided that they only wanted to go on confirmed test results in case people were making sort of malicious or false self-diagnoses. Sort of you can see how a group of sixth form students who fancied not being in school might decide that self-declaring that someone had got coronavirus without being tested would be a good way of achieving that end. So I think there have been a lot of lessons learned as we've gone through this process. And I think as well, the government needs to be a lot clearer about what it's trying to achieve with these tools, what they're there for. I think people would willingly give up data in the course of the national good and public health, but they probably would like to see that data destroyed at the end of the exercise, or at least know what the limitations of its usage are going to be. Indeed, Australia adopted that approach.
Yeah, there has been sort of like a lack of clarity in terms of some of the longer term issues. So originally with the test and trace system and data being contacted manually through sort of the human process that's going on, the retention period for that data was 20 years to begin with, and there was very little sort of reasoning given behind that. So when people were handing over details of their contacts and sort of related information when they've been tested, that sort of system, it wasn't clear why there was needed to be kept for 20 years, and now the Department of Health has backtracked and said that they're only going to retain that data for 8 years. So I think it comes a little bit back to this overall sort of like impression of sort of the coordinated response, the transparency, the trust, and also with the app in particular, I think what stage it was really being developed for, because when the work on the app first started, we were very much at nearing the peak of the number of coronavirus cases we had. And was the app going to be deployed at that stage? Would it be useful at that stage as a piece of technology and effective? Because people were very much in lockdown at that situation. They weren't traveling, they weren't going outside very often. And then if you'd rolled out an app at that stage, would it have been useful? Would people have trusted it to a stage where we're now in a situation where people are going out, being more active, being more mobile? Would they still be using it if they'd had false reports from early on? And I don't think there was that clarity around when the app was actually sort of designed and intended to be used and to be put out as an answer or as a solution. And I think that one of the sort of things that we can learn from this is that these technologies, there is purpose and value in creating them, but we need to be able to also have a sort of an evidence base to suggest that they're going to be effective and useful and trusted by the public. And as sort of the pandemic unfolds over the next however many months, years, etc., it takes to develop a vaccine, and methods and strategies in place to develop it, where does this app, if the UK uses one, where does it come into play at that stage, and what's its purpose, and how do you get people to trust it? And these are the sorts of questions we should be sort of pressing for more answers on, and really trying to understand more as work continues on an app in the UK, and learning lessons from abroad as well, I think is crucial.
Michael, I'd like to bring you into the discussion because I mean, you've been doing a lot of work looking at the way in which data is used. Do you think there is a lack of public trust now? Maybe as a hangover of the Cambridge Analytica affair and other things that have happened since, where people are increasingly concerned about how data is gathered and used and what rights they have over that.
Definitely, I think there's a concern that that effectively systems can become more and more invasive over time. It's really one of the motivators. We started work on a contact tracing app back in early March with colleagues from 8 universities around Europe, and Apple and Google based their idea on our research that we went forwards. And our motivating factor there was to show that you can do Bluetooth contact tracing without collecting and centralizing huge amounts of personal data, and with credibly saying, we're not in this for a data grab, we're in it to do contact tracing and no more. And that is also, there's a few different aspects to that. One of that is to say, put your cards on the table. This can't turn into a surveillance device. It can't creep beyond what people will trust it for. Being also aware that it has to be adopted in many countries. We were working particularly with the Swiss public health authorities, but also in Germany, and the systems that they both rolled out apps with millions of downloads now. The other part of that is that we are bound into the platforms that apps run on because of a lack of really regulation, also enforcement of existing regulation for many years. We find ourselves in a position where we are at the behest of particularly Apple and Google in relation to what can run on systems that we own, and you have to work in that environment. I mean, we weren't designing for something that could be taken up easily by Apple and Google, but in the end, knowing these companies don't, Apple in particular, doesn't wish to facilitate the centralization of data. They have their own reputational risks. They have their own preferences about what they want their systems to be used for. There is a kind of realpolitik that you play as a software developer, particularly if you're trying to do something as ambitious as a contact tracing system. In the UK, or rather in England, because NHSX is NHS England, that was not really understood, I think. And it's interesting, maybe throughout the world, despite Cambridge Analytica, that states have been reluctant to legislate here. We haven't seen you didn't see NHSX try and place a quickly written law that would try and get Apple or Google to change their operating system to allow their own app to work better. I think that's just not in their mind to do these days, and that's worrying. France was saying during this whole process, France and the UK were really the only two countries holding out in the West for centralized contact tracing apps. France has really made a big deal publicly in its parliament about a lack of sovereignty and saying that, this is really showing that Apple and Google are controlling things and we're standing up against them. But again, they didn't propose any law. It's the first thing you really should be looking at as a sovereign nation, to say, well, why are we saying we're not sovereign if you're not trying the tools of a sovereign nation first? It's a very strange reticence to get involved in these companies. We maybe see it with taxation as well. I think it's something that we need to fix to get that trust back and to think, yes, the public is in control of what happens and doesn't happen, and they can trust technology.
Yeah, I want to come on and talk about that in a minute, certainly in the context of the trade agreements that are coming up as well, which is a really clear space where governments have the power to act and to decide. But within this argument on data also comes up something a fairly tricky subject, which is the issue of inferred data. I remember when we were doing the select committee hearings with Chris Veale, he sort of explained to me as, if I lent you a book and you translated that book into French and gave me my book back, now I've got my book, my original set of data, but you've got a copy of it which gives you all of the information you need from it, but just in a different form. And I think there's a concern as well about when we share data with organizations, even if it's then destroyed afterwards, or in the case of, say, someone who gets their Facebook back from data, the company we've engaged with still benefits from having that data and can still use it in other ways.
There's two problems with that framing, and they're problems that are very interesting to unpack a bit. But firstly, inferred data, when we think of inferences, we kind of think like a Sherlock Holmes style of approach, where we find out something that is also human understandable, like your favorite color or your favorite food or you whatever, where you would want to go on holiday or these kind of things. That's not how these systems tend to work in practice, but it is how a lot of lobbyists from technology companies want to pretend that's how they work in practice. In practice, they are more about optimizing people than inferring things. They're not trying to find out something secret about individuals. They're trying to take a whole group, a whole population of people, and optimize them to extract value from them. Technologically, this works. This really works by placing, imagining everyone's a data point. It's about how they relate to each other. So in a Google profile, for example, will have an individual, and they'll be placed in a data space, and they might have 10,000, 20,000 dimensions. These don't mean anything. But if you imagine that it's like a three-dimensional space, you've got different dots in different positions. They're close to each other, or they're far away, or they're close on an x-axis or a y-axis. You can say something about why those people are like each other or not like each other. If you take that to the extreme, with thousands and thousands of dimensions, you can cluster people in ways that the company doesn't understand, but can still monetize. So that's one thing to bear in mind. It's even more subtle than inference. It's a real want to cluster and to extract value from people. The second challenge with that frame, which is important going forwards, and the contact tracing app actually exemplifies this, is that you don't need data to do this in the same way that we might assume. So the contact tracing app, the version that we created, Apple and Google then built on, data doesn't leave your device, personal data. It doesn't get centralized in a single place, but it still does its function of alerting people. This is because you can bring the analytics to the data rather than the other way around. Typically, we thought we need to put data in one place, but it's possible the other way around too. Google, at the moment, Google controls Google Chrome. Many people will be using Google Chrome right now while listening to this. Google Chrome is planning at some point to abolish third-party cookies and people, which would kind of the bread and butter of tracking online. The reason they're doing that is because their plan is to do targeting of individuals, micro-targeting of individuals in the browser. They use privacy technologies that say, oh, we never see your data. We don't know who you are, but we can still deliver highly targeted, even political adverts to you, while plausibly be saying, you want to raid our data centers? That's fine. We don't have data on anyone. We just control the pipes. And through using cryptography and using privacy tools, you can control the pipes, but also shape what populations see and do. And that's the next step. So there's been hard lobbying saying, it's all about data. Oh, don't regulate our data, because that's not, the rug is being pulled out from under people's feet. It's about the infrastructures of targeting and optimization that these companies are focusing on. And data used to be necessary for micro-targeting, to have data in one place. Don't need it anymore if you control the pipes.
Yeah. I mean, just finally, I think before we have to close, on this bit, as we speak, the Internet Association, which is the lobby group for a lot of the big tech companies, is actively lobbying at the moment for a lot of the limits from liability for tech companies to be locked in place in a UK-US trade agreement. This would roll over some of the laws that exist in America, which make the tech companies immune, would give them protection from any liability for content, but would also seem that they are seeking to create exemptions from GDPR and processing UK citizens' data. If they could process UK citizens' data under US law, then that would give them a lot more freedom than they have now.
Yes. So internet, in law scholarship we would call intermediary liability, has been a regime from the 90s. It started off with particularly rights holders of copyrighted material trying to sue internet service providers. And courts in the UK and elsewhere rightly said, it's not going to be great for the internet if people keep trying to sue Virgin Media or NTL World or whatever for what's happening through their network that they're not even aware of. But over time, that's morphed into protection from platforms, which, unlike internet service providers, actively shape what people are seeing and doing and monetize it in a very different way. So that regime has moved into keeping these organizations totally immune. Typically, under Europe, data protection law has been not part of this regime. So the e-commerce directive, which shapes the UK's intermediary liability regime, does not include data protection. And it's been a bit of a tension. But the US would love to really put a very hard immunity like you get in Section 230 of the CDA there into UK law. And we should be very wary of that. It does reduce our wiggle room. The US particularly placed a regime which it gives immunity regardless of whether you're aware of content or not that's illegal on the platform. In Europe, there was always a more graduated area that's almost a notice and take down idea. If you find out about something, you lose the immunities unless you take it down. So there's always been a difference, and so that lobbying is really open. And the UK needs to consider where it goes. In the EU, the Digital Services Act is under negotiation, and that involves changes to intermediary liability and areas around it. And it's a really important question about where the UK goes in this area going forwards, and how this interacts with many other policy areas, online harms and others.
Absolutely right. And I think we've talked about this on the podcast before, but I think it goes back to the point you made earlier. It's a really good way of governments demonstrating what they want. They've got the power to negotiate these treaties. They've got the power to make sure that these carve-out, these exemptions are not part of the trade agreement, and therefore not part of our legal framework, or not. And I'm sure this will be a hot debate in Parliament over the next few months as these treaties start to take shape. I will certainly be keeping a very close eye on it, as I know a number of other people will as well. You've been listening to the Infotagion podcast, hosted by me, Damian Collins, and featuring Matt Burgess, Michael Veale, and Lucy Dargahi. It was also produced by Lucy and David Dargahi. You can find out more about Infotagion, the independent COVID-19 fact-checking service recommended by Ofcom, and send us examples of disinformation you've seen by visiting our website, infotagion.com, or using #IsolateTheLies on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Thank you until next time.